Hey, welcome, Talent Warriors, to the next episode of the Talent War podcast. This is George Randle, and stand by for one of our absolute best segments. We have Pam Owens, and a short background is she is a diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging consultant. Hot topic in today's market. And many people are going to be, oh my God, we've got to talk about diversity. Many people are going to go, oh, I do not want to hear about diversity. But what I want to share with you in advance of listening to this is Pam Owens is, in my previous life at this firm, she came in, and I've never walked out of a room with more great information, great thought leadership around talent and a diversity perspective. This is a perspective you never will hear anywhere else. And truly, I count her as a colleague in the top 5%. She is just absolutely amazing. So if you want to know how to do diversity, equity, and inclusion right, what you should be looking at, what you should be thinking about, how you should approach it, the diversity talent mindset, stand by for one of our best episodes ever.
Folks, welcome to the Talent War podcast, and we are here with Pamela Benson Owens, and it took forever for us to connect. But before she starts talking about her career, what I did include in the intro is in my 20 plus years in talent acquisition, I've worked with a lot of people that are thought leaders and people that really care about driving leaders and their perspective on talent to a whole new level. And I'm really, really grateful, Pamela, that you came on, because as we were talking about before we started to record, there's any number of people that come in, consultants, and they drive me batshit crazy. It really is nuts. But I remember the first time you came in, and I have to admit, the bias, as they say, I'm like, okay, we've got another consultant that's going to tell us about something. And for everybody listening, this is truly one of the rare times that I had a consultant come in and I walked out of that room a far, far better leader. So with that, we have the great Pamela. Tell us how you got into talent and walk us into how and what you're doing today, because I want everybody, I think they're going to get so much out of just listening to you. It's going to be one of our best podcasts ever.
Oh, I love that. Well, thanks for having me, George. You're one of my faves in the talent game. So I never heard that story. So I'm stunned because you never know. But I fell into this work in HR and such by way of, like we all do, which is mistake. Nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to be an HR professional. You just kind of get into it. So I ended up in my first job in an HR department as a generalist. And the CEO at the time, as respectfully as he could say it, said, you really don't filter your responses on what we need to be doing. And so that wasn't necessarily a compliment at the time, but we are still in touch, and now it is. And he talks about the path to being direct in the work that we're doing. And then I started in the DEI path, got a certification in college, thought, hey, I probably need this, never knew how I would use it. So I'm now like 28 in the merging of this work. And I would say at the end of the day, there are no experts in DEI at all. So if you're in an organization, you're getting ready to think you're hiring a DEI consultant, they call themselves an expert, run for the hills. There are no experts. There are practitioners and those who are proficient. It's too complex and multifaceted and people-based and organizational culture-based to ever say they're an expert. So when I hear that, I think to myself, ego-driven, not outcomes-driven, and I'm tapping out. So anyway, my career has been in this path. I went from working in corporations to then working in nonprofits to then working in faith-based communities, and all along the way, owning my own consulting firm. I dual CEO right now at a company called Edge of Your Seat Consulting that I started. And I also CEO by way of being voluntold by the elders in this community that I would run the Black Cultural Arts District on the east side of town. And I'm in my 4th year of doing that. And that has been a PhD in everything I thought I knew. I was not particularly correct. So that's where I am now.
It's kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing that the older, I remember, and I've told this story before, when I was growing up and I was 17 or 18, I thought my dad was an idiot, And to your comment you just made, the older I get, the more I know I don't know. And so.
Oh, George, I think we should co-author a book when we decide. You have to first retire completely from the work because you can't We know too much. But when we get
Yeah.
told we should co-author a book called Whatever We Thought It Was, that's not it.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? I actually had an idea, and that's funny. We're going to do this. And if anybody steals this idea, I've copyrighted it already. And this is so off topic, but one of the funniest books I ever read, and it had to have been 15, 20 years ago, but there were two flight attendants that got together and wrote a book on the funniest moments that happen in the airline industry. And they disguised all their names, but there were times where I was I will laugh so hard that I cry in a good movie, but not in a book. And then
Right.
this one, it had me just going. So if you and I just disguised names and companies, I think we could write a book that would just shock the world about what is HR really, really like. But so I know we're time limited, but I wanted to jump into something because, and you met me, I'm like you, I speak my mind, and we ended up later on down the road hiring a director of DE&I, and he got dizzy running in circles chasing the spotlight.
Mm-hmm.
And I have always had a different perspective on diversity from most people because I was so fortunate, and the co-author of my book, Mike Sorelli, and the people that work at the Talent War Group, we all grew up in the military. It was kind of either you're a stud or you're a dud. You got my back, you could shoot straight, you're fit, I can count on you, you're loyal. We may not go to the same clubs, we may not eat the same food, we may not go to the same church. We don't care, but you either got my back or you don't. And it was, so you grew up in that environment, you got used to meeting people of different cultures, different ethnicities, different backgrounds and experiences. But at the end of the day, you kind of had this joint mission. But I know the civilian world doesn't have that luxury. So diversity, all that to say, diversity was an education for me. But I gotta say, I've watched people hop on the DE&I bandwagon because they think they have to have it. And I remember, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I remember you said something, and I think I've had too many concussions, so my memory can be off. But you said, diversity is always like a thread that has to run through all you're doing in life. And I was like, yes. And so, God, I got to just get into the question, but it is front and center. But when you look at the DEI industry and consultants, are we doing it right? Are we doing it wrong? Is it a mix? What are you seeing when you talk to people?
Well, first of all, I got to roll back to the time we were in that room together. And once you gave me enough of your background, here is why I think you were sitting in that space. Like, here we go again, yet another consultant, because by way of your background and conditioning, you were exposed very differently. It was automatic for you, right? So you're like, why is it now a thing? When in the way you grew up, right, in the military, which by the way is one of the best teachers, by the way, of how to do it, because they are, you could not figure out, like, why are we making this a thing? Because for you, it was just part of the ethos of who you are. So now we got to sit in a room and actually name this thing that I do automatically in my work. And the answer is not everybody's exposed and conditioned like you are, George. So yes, right? But that's why I think you struggled with it so much, because you were like, okay, but it was so automatic for you that you didn't feel like it needed its, a plan and a deliverable. You're like, of course, that's how we operate. Well, unfortunately, that's not how we always operate. So when you talk about DEI consultants, I don't like many, to be honest. And the reason why is because it has become an opportunity to create performative behaviors around certain aspects of diversity. So I always look at people's statements. So when somebody says, like, how do you know if we're doing it right? To your question, like, how do we know if we're doing it right? First of all, the only right there is what fits for your organization, that the culture you already have, the core values, the mission and vision, and the rules of engagement of how you behave and operate. If you are in a company and you're like, we're going to actually use their definitions of what equity, inclusion, and diversity is, you're already messing up. So the first thing is, hey, who are we already? You got to do an identity check. Like, who are we? Right? And then it becomes, these pieces are important. How do we lay those over who we are so that we still resemble ourselves when we get to the other side of it? So my beef always with, in the last 2 years since the George Floyd bubbling up, I would get calls almost every week, and organizations would say, Pam, can you make us anti-racist by Friday? And I would be like, I am not your consultant. That is dumb as heck to me. What? No, there are 45 things to do before we talk about that, at least. Who are you as an organization, right? What is your approach to promoting? How do you create engagement? What's morale like? Like, I've got 50 questions before we ever talk about that. If you don't anchor that, your DEI plan is crap. It's not going to work. It's not going to take hold in the organization.
As I've said many times, with the post-pandemic, the pandemic, and the great resignation, it is the era of the CHRO. Your HR and your talent acquisition teams are the front line as you fight the war for talent. Like any essential component, they need to be fortified, trained, and supported. Talent War Group's talent acquisition and HR consulting development service helps your organization learn to attract and retain top talent and help you gain an advantage against your competitors. Our current job market, like I said, is the great resignation. And now the great attrition is what you're seeing, and many other names due to the record number of workers quitting their jobs. 52% of the employees are currently looking for a new job. So let us help you get it right, know what the best talent looks like, attract the best talent, and help your company thrive. The Talent War Group brings a unique set of skills to help you take your business to the next level. You can get started by finding us at talentwargroup.com and let us help you develop your next generation of leaders. You know what, Pam? Don't feel like you have to sugarcoat things. I think you can give them to us straight here, all right? You're right. And I remember, later on after our meeting and how it developed at that company, and the guy that came in, I would never, ever question his intent. I think his intent and the results that he wanted to bring about and change, I thought were absolutely admirable and something that garnered my 100% support. The how he did it, to your point, but so many people are jumping into it, and I would imagine they think that you're carrying some kind of magic wand where you can make it happen. But if you were to walk into a company, you know what? I'm going to back up a minute. I want to get some definitions straight, educate our listeners, because it's been D&I, it's been DE&I, and now recently we're seeing DEI and B. So could you give us the basic definitions of, because it has evolved, but what are we talking about when we say diversity? What are we talking about? Inclusion, equity, belonging? What does that mean to our listeners?
Best question ever. And my general answer is, it depends on how each organization defines it. But I will tell you, in my organization, the thing that has been driving people crazy, if I look at your definitions of EDI, DEI, DEIB, DEIBJ now, because they're adding justice, let me just give you a little education there.
Oh, hey, yeah, okay.
New letter. Then if I get to 2 sentences, I'm tapping out. Right? So I look at these statements like diversity is defined as, so in my organization, very simple: diversity, difference, equity, fairness, inclusion, all voices heard, belonging. We hired you, we must like you. Done. Like, that's it. That's all we're doing here, right? Because anything other than that is like you're having to prove to yourself that you understand, right? Nobody's subscribing to that. So I'm always saying to people, like, you have to define it for your organization. But if you get into paragraph 2, we have an organizational culture issue, right? If you have to spin silk to define it, we've got bigger issues. We've either got a leadership issue. We've either got some incongruence with mission and vision and values. There's something else happening in amok in an organization if you can't anchor it easily.
Simplicity is one of those things that, we talk about as a leadership principle. If you can't make something simple, it's rarely going to get from the top to the bottom. And, I almost think, and I think it's a mathematical, I'm bad at math, I shouldn't talk about math. But to your point, the more words you put into any of those statements, or the more words you put into a values and mission statement that you hang on the wall, the more words there are, the higher the likelihood it ain't happening.
It's on the shelf, right?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And if it's simple, we had this mantra on our TA team, and it was called teamwork, ownership, humility. And they can remember that. That was it. I'm like, if we do those three things, we're solid. We're good. I'm going to jump all the way around because I'm always so curious about this. But I hate blanket statements. But for our listeners, if you were to say, hey, these are the top three things that I'm seeing that take people down the wrong path when it comes to either establishing a program, or I don't even want to say establishing a program because it has to be within the leadership fabric of your company. That's where it is. It has to be a mindset, like we had the military. What are the three things you think that get people off on the wrong foot, or three general directions that you've seen clients that you've had to work with that are mistakes that people definitely need to avoid doing to start out?
Right off the bat, reactive versus responsive stance, right? So something happens, we need a statement. Put it out yesterday. Everybody's got to agree. No, you don't. Who told you that? Nobody has to put out a statement. As a matter of fact, don't.
Thank you.
Right?
Oh my God. We're going
Right?
down the path on this one. Yeah.
Right? Like, why do we need a statement? So when all that bubbled up, I must have had 500 calls on, we need a statement. Can you edit the statement? Why are you doing a statement? Ben and Jerry's did a statement. Okay. Why are you doing a statement? Can't
Yeah.
answer that? Don't do it. Like, right?
Yeah.
So first it's like reactive. Everything's reactive. No, you actually mess up when you're in a reactive state. Stand back, check who are we, organizational identity, organizational values. Okay, now based on that, right? Do we need to make it a statement? And if we do, what is it? Why? Because when you're in reactive stance, every corporation now thinks they're a social justice organization and can't figure out why they keep having to do mediations between employees. Like, you're not a social justice organization. Back up, right? You're a high tech company that values diversity. Do that, not this other piece. So my first thing would be reactive stance versus responsive stance. The next thing for me would be, at the end of the day, one of the things that, keeps onboarding is you've called it a program. You've called it an initiative. You have now got 65 affinity groups. No. The first thing to say is, and so to me, that's from a scarcity mentality. Like, we're not doing it right. We haven't even defined what right is in these other places. So in order for us to feel better about our egos, we're going to actually, by way of our conflict avoidance, throw all this stuff out there and have 75 affinity groups that are not effective.
Yeah.
We're going to have a calendar full of every, we're going to now, because we don't want to leave anybody out, it's now Merry Christmas Kwanzaa. Now we're going to celebrate Merry Christmas Kwanzaa here at the company, right? And so, I'm making a joke, but I've seen it. Like, wait, what are we doing? Right? And then we're going to throw in a fiesta for Cinco de Mayo. Like, stop, hold up, right? Who are we? So I see that as a big piece of it too. It's like, we don't know what to do, so we're going to do anything. Third is, nobody stops and says, what's our current culture? What is it? Right? We step right over culture. Culture is large and expansive, and it encompasses a lot of things, George. Like, there's a lot in an organizational culture. If I step into an organization, I don't know the organizational culture. There's the HR handbook that tells me all the things, but then there's this other handbook that says stuff like, you better put the right coffee in the coffee machine, or, right, there's stuff that you learn along the way. We don't ever take the time to figure out, like, what are the positives of that, and then build on that as a stepping stone. We act like that's not there, and then we create stumbling blocks for ourselves. And then you got to call the consultant to have facilitated conversations, because we've gone off-roading on the EDI, DEI, DEIB, DEIBJ plan. All avoidable. We don't do it.
I got to think, how you're speaking just cracks me up, because I think the laughter that I'm having is just the joy of reliving hearing you with such a breath of fresh air, because it's like, okay, who are we? Do we know? And it's funny, just from that question, I remember I was given a speech to this large group, and CEO was talking about hiring, was talking about diversity, and he said, go ahead, George, ask me a hard question. I said, well, why the hell should I work for you? It was a CEO, and it stumped him. And CEOs don't even know why somebody should work for them. And it must be apparent that a lot of the companies that you come to really may not know who they are. So how do they figure that out? How do you recommend a company figure out who are you? How
Well,
do you go about doing that?
you're gonna hate this answer, or no, you'll probably love it.
I like it.
I make companies walk through who they are not first. Here's why.
Okay.
In the spirit of leadership and humanity, regardless of how strong we are, there's usually an undercurrent of, we want to make sure that we are likable and people can respond to us.
Mhm.
And those pieces are important. But when they are over indexed, they become a weakness. And so it creates this identity crisis versus who are we not? What am I not first? That backs you into, as an organization, who you are. And you got to be comfortable saying, I know that you brought that to me, but we don't do that. That's not who we are. We need to practice. We need to get our muscle memory around. No, we don't. That's not who we are. That's somebody else. That's great. We can't do all things, right? I always say to people, what I feel like in the last year is this is my scenario when I walk into an organization. It's like a time that I pulled up in Dallas, Texas to speak, and I pull up at this restaurant and it says donuts, Italian food, Chinese food, Thai, Greek food, right? And I looked at the building and I went, you're not going to do all those things well. I see the intention, but the impact is going to be bad, right? And so we then do this laundry list of all the things that we have to be versus the things that we don't do and be firm in those. And that informs us of who we are as an organization, as a leader, as HR professionals, as talent, cultivators. And we need to get more comfortable with that space. We think if we say what we're not, that we're claiming that we can't do something. That's really a position of strength to say, I don't do those things, right? Mm-hmm. DEI professionals, no matter what happens, my experience in general has been, and I might like 1 in every 16 DEI professional. Why? Because you walk into a company and it's like, I can do all of that. Whereas I'll walk into a company and go, I actually don't do that. That is not congruent with what I believe. I can do this for you, but I'm not doing that. And in the company that we met in, one of my biggest things was when they brought on somebody and I was interacting with that person for some time, great person, and started getting the pressure of rolling out all these deliverables. I said, you have jumped the shark. You don't know them well enough to roll anything out. Have you had 75 conversations with George? You don't know George yet, right? Have you talked to the executive team? You had 3 meetings? You're not ready, right? So then, of course, it became this carousel of language about what to do when nobody stopped and said, what are we already doing well? Mm-hmm. What are we expanding on? Versus, no. Got to start from scratch and build this whole thing and hire an army. And no. What are we doing well? And what do we need to expand on as the launching pad of what we're doing well? Sure, we look at the data. We're not, we see that we need to strengthen some things. But when you do it too prematurely, you roll into this like Noah's Ark of DEI. I need 2 of this and 2 of this and 2 of this and 2 of this. Call it. And that is not authentic. It's actually disingenuous and insulting.
This episode is sponsored by Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm. We help you attract, retain, and develop your top talent because we know that the most valuable asset within your organization is your talent. With services like leadership development, talent acquisition and HR consulting, executive search, executive coaching, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to your most pressing business problems. You can get started by finding us at talentwargroup.com and let us help you develop your next generation of leaders. Also, if you like what we're doing here at the podcast, please leave a review as it helps us support and continue this podcast. It helps us support people who are really dedicated to improving their business skills and excelling above all else. I got to say, kind of admit one thing, that was really my take on a lot of those things. When I would be at different companies, the DEI would be a program. I'm like, we're being disingenuous here. But I don't know if other people thought that way. people of color, people of different backgrounds, being an old white male, which is what I am. I didn't have a choice in that. That was mom and dad. But I always thought it was disingenuous. I'm like, for me, because I've always it's hard enough to find good talent as it is. And then laying some preconceived notion bias on top of it, it always just drove me nuts. I'm going to be all over the map with questions, and I know you can handle whatever I throw. Do you find yourself more educating and building and helping get people on the right path, or now based on where we are, because George Floyd was that 2020?
Mm-hmm.
Do I have that right?
2020.
I hate to say in media terms, that's a lifetime ago. Do you find yourself now building and constructing and educating, or do you find yourself unwinding PAD programs more? It's just curiosity of mine.
It's about 50-50. I'm still in the building, educating, it's still hot building. But again, I started in the 90s. So I'm like, people are like, have you heard of unconscious bias? I'm like, yeah. Like, what? It's not new. It's like my kids when they're like, Mom, have you heard of Van Halen? I'm like, before you, that's not new. But I try to support. But I have 50% of like, I'm building and educating and convincing. What I did decide to do is I no longer convince and persuade. I don't do that work anymore. I simply sit in the building, educating, creating awareness. And then the other half is undoing, reworking, reframing, resetting. Right. And mostly those are my organizations. Like I had one organization who was like, you told us not to do a statement. And so instead we put out Black Lives Matter shirts to all of our employees with matching water bottles. I'm like, did you? Great idea. Who came up with that? Was the whole executive team in there? Yep. We just wanted to show our solidarity. Bad move. Caused all kinds of stink, right, in the organization. So my point is like, those are the organizations that just felt like they had to do something, didn't know what to do, and felt like it was better to just do something, have created a swell of another layer of performative, disingenuous, inauthentic in an organization that was actually doing well in their surveys on all the things regarding engagement, retention. They literally undid it because they didn't start by way of what the culture already was.
Yeah, there was a question on here. Yeah, there was a question on here to ask you the pitfalls, but I know that they're all coming out. When I do executive coaching, I met with this guy. This is a long way around the barn into the question. But I went out and met with this client, and he said, George, I want to hire you. And I said, well, we need to talk some more before we figure out if we're going to work together. And I won't name the firm. I won't name any of it. It'll give it away because too many people know of this person. Very high ego. I mean, like off the charts. In the field, it's almost a prerequisite. But I remember asking him, he says, well, look, I'll pay you whatever to pay you. And he said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, well, if I figure out that you're an asshole, I'm not working with you. And he was shocked by that and usually wouldn't swear in a podcast. But that's exactly what I told him. And he could handle that kind of, that level of firmness and a little bit of vulgarity, a little unprofessional. But do you ever walk into a place, and we're not going to say you're an expert at it, we're saying you are truly the best practitioner I know and have seen. But do you ever walk in with kind of negotiables and non-negotiables? Like you've walked into a client and if as an example, C-suite's not on board or some department brought you in, are there negotiables or non-negotiables for you to be working with somebody? Because I know they have been, and your time is extremely valuable and there's a ton of demand. How do you handle that?
I love that question. So I always tell people that you need a few non-negotiables, but I won't work with people that have a lot of them. That says something to me. Like if you have 5 pages of non-negotiables, that means you're easily offended, which means you're easily manipulated.
Yeah.
So I won't take you, right? Like I'm like, nope, too hard. I will say that I don't have many. I don't scare easily. I think it's important to have the C-suite, understanding the importance of it. I think most in that space know the what, but don't know the how. And so I like to help with the palatable ways in which you onboard the how. My biggest non-negotiable that I'm going to tell you has been the last year for me. I am done working with white male executives who have gotten in the fetal position on this subject matter and act like they have no general damn sense about anything. I do fire that because it's like, I get it. Okay, you're worried about whatever that is, but you cannot then decide that you've had to abandon all your good common sense.
Yeah.
Like, you have some foundational pieces. You're in an executive position. So what scares me about the work is I get that we're conditioned and exposed differently. And so you might not have worked in the DEI space specifically, but that doesn't mean you don't have some general good sense about how
Hmm.
things should go. You might need a tweak, but what I have found, it's like, Pam, I'm going to be over here in the fetal position and hope it works out. I won't work with
Yeah.
that because I
Good for
actually need
you.
you to be your total white self.
Yeah.
I need you to be your white male self in this space, doing this work
Yes.
alongside me, not void of your good sense.
Yeah.
It's not help. It's like nails in the road. I'm like, oh my gosh, are you again saying, and it's like, I'll defer to you. Why are you deferring to me? You're the CEO.
Yeah.
You don't
Lead. Yes.
like lead
Lead, for
something.
God's sakes.
And if you go off-roading, I will politely pull you aside and go, here's a perception on that. Not that I should change you, but I just want you to be aware of how that could
Hmm.
be perceived. That's it. You don't need a
Yeah.
total rework because you're a white dude. You know something. So that irks me. That when you talk about a non-negotiable, that's it. It's like,
Oh,
really?
yeah. I could see that. I love that. I need you to be your old white self. And I haven't mentioned it on the podcast, but a significant other of mine is a C-suite executive. And she's going to eventually do this book on, that helps women ask for what they deserve because she's a tiny bit older than me. Hopefully she didn't hear me say that on a podcast. She looks younger than me. That's my saving grace. But, she made a statement to me that I thought was good. I wanted to run it by you with that old white self. He says, when we have people instructing or facilitating meetings about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it's a person of color and it's usually a female. And she said, I hate that. She said, I want the old white male chief revenue officer, head of sales, standing up there telling us about not what they're going to do, how we're going to do it, why we're doing it. Because then she said, she was very blunt. She's like, it looks like tokenism. Like it looks more like programmatic and not thoughtful. But if you have that old white male standing up there saying, hey, this is what we should this is who we are, do it. It carries more weight. Does that make sense?
I absolutely hear that. Boy, I would love to be in a room having that discussion with her. I bet we'd get along. I absolutely hear that. And what I say to people is, it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? I
Yeah.
actually need to model the old white male and the woman of color, male of color, BIPOC, whatever, LGBT, whatever, doing it together. Wouldn't that be an interesting model?
Yes.
Let's do that, And so what happens though in that space is because we're so worried about what might be perceived, we think we define DE&I by way of race only. And we're like, the next person we hire, the next DEI consultant we have has to be a Black female with short hair. And like we get real prescriptive. And I'm like, well, who's doing that? Well, what is that? Right. So we miss out on opportunities. And part of that, to her point and to your point, George, is part of that piece that we are doing brings in bias. The stuff that we're trying to combat in the organization
Yes.
brings in bias. And I always talk to people, and I'll be real quick. It's like we moved on this street and we were warned that we should not go and talk to lot 14 because that family was mean and they were this and that. And they got a big political sign up on their fence. Don't talk to them. So when we moved in, my husband and I went to lot 14 first.
Yeah.
Immediately, because we were warned about lot 14. We spent 4 hours with lot 14. And guess what? Surprise. Like them, probably the best. He and I fished together. The neighbors don't know what to do as we walk down the street and our waiters going down to the end to fish. We're like, we can't imagine what that's like. What would it look like if we just got to know each other in the organization? Right? Right? Have we decided who George is without George telling us who George is?
Yeah.
That's unloading unconscious bias.
Mm-hmm.
The very thing we're trying to not do we've decided that it's got to look a certain way, and then we do it. Oh,
Yeah,
nobody likes my answer on that, but that is my
I do.
answer.
So many things, I've learned so much from you. I want to tackle, because I know we'll be up against time. This is a hard one, I think, for especially human capital leaders and leaders in general, is the equity piece.
Hmm.
I don't want to say diversity is easier than equity. I don't want to rank order or rack and stack. But the equity piece has got to be really hard to do when you start factoring in performance, when you start factoring in years of experience, background, the role, meaning there's a lot outside of that that has nothing to do with who that person is necessarily. So if you were to kind of give best practices or best approaches or advice to tackle the equity piece, what are you sharing with people?
So, what I would say about the equity piece, let's say an organization does an assessment and they realize they have had some missteps in equity for whatever reason. I could talk
Mm-hmm.
about that, how that happens by way of history. I could talk about that industry. I could
Mm-hmm.
talk about that from a variety of angles. But let's just say we're sitting at the table, we're on a team together, and we recognize we're seeing a trend that there's an equity issue among whatever pieces those are, pay, promotion, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The way to right size that is not in one fell swoop, right? It's like, okay, so we're going to right size equity and we're just going to level that. People always think it works like that. It does not work like that. We have to look at a variety of factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are a variety of factors that we have to look at. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't get to that. But what happens is the reason why I think people misstep in that and the pressure comes on is like, we've got an equity issue. It should be this. And I always tell organizations, don't should on yourself. You're going to mess up.
Mm-hmm.
Back up and say, what is it that we currently have? I have to deal with what is. Okay, let's look at what is and let's build steps to what should be. But what companies do is it should be this and let's fix it reactively. And they don't
Mm-hmm.
look at the churn of what that creates, right? Then what are we saying to, when I hear people say, hey, when you get ready to hire this next person, it should be this. You set the leader up
Yeah.
for a hot mess. They can't even listen in interviews well because now we've laid over them this pressure of like, you're going to right size equity, like the missteps of equity in this company that have been going on forever. You're going to write it in 2 hires. No, you're
Yeah.
not. As a matter of fact, you're going to actually do something counter to that. So I say to organizations, anchor culture first, anchor values first, determine what you are not, sit down with your team on the ways in which we can shore up consistency in interviews, questions, approach, all those things. Get those pieces first and back into those pieces. So now let's test for equity. Are there ways in which we might have done some unconscious bias? Okay, maybe. Are there ways in which we went about this position differently than this position? Yes. Why? Because that's a sales position and that's forward facing and that's internal. Okay, as long as you can name it,
Yeah.
right? We get scared to name it. We're not willing to sit in the nuance of that. And I think it doesn't serve us well when we don't. Like we never hash it out. Like, why, George, why did you take that approach? If you ask George, George probably has a perfectly good reason. And if George is leveraging some unconscious bias, then as your colleague, I have the courage to say, George, I got to ask you a couple questions on that one. I
Yeah.
see that you judge that person's bookshelf in that Zoom interview.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you judge? Can I ask you what that brought on for you? Well, it's this and this and this. George might be able to back up George, right? But we just decide. And so I think there's opportunities for us to really look at it in totality versus one aspect.
Like I say, I'm all over the map here. We just I had this philosophy, and the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, the blurring of the political, the social, the workplace, the business. I've never seen anything like it. I don't know that pendulum will ever swing back. But Disney's getting hammered. Now I would tell everybody my personal view is every single news outlet, it's like clickbait at this point. I just don't even go down that path. But I remember, to your point about making a statement, so many people feel like they need to make statements. And I was coaching a leader, and I don't know that I necessarily did the right thing, but to your point, he wanted everything. Oh, we got to get this message out. We got to support this group. We got to support this group. And I said, how are you supporting the people in your firm?
First in.
Before we look outside, before we get into politics, before we get into, am I supporting this group, that charitable organization, or this social cause, or this social justice cause? What are you doing for the people that you're in charge of leading? And that was been my advice to some of the people that I'm coaching. I don't have your expertise, but I'm like, when you get talent in that inclusion part, are those voices being heard? Are you taking care of them? I think, are people being more heard now or less heard now? What do you think? That's a
I
hard one, I
think,
know.
oh my gosh, George, in 5 words, right? I think people are being heard differently, but I don't think it's served us well in terms of the commingling
Hmm.
of, it's been a cacophony of things, and the commingling of that has not served us well. And I think what it's brought on is people are then in this posture of shame, blame, guilt, and all of that versus,
Yeah,
hey, I heard what you said. My experience is different. I hold space for how you've been conditioned in yours, but the way you've been conditioned in yours does not make mine wrong.
exactly.
It makes mine different, right? And because we don't do those things, people have shut down. People who
Hmm.
actually have something to say are like, pass, I'm not going to say it because
Yep.
the collateral damage on it has
Hmm.
become career shortening for people, has altered their, their DNA in terms of how they show up in the space. And when we start having more parking lot conversations than we have boardroom in the room, all hands conversations,
Yep.
we are really off base.
Yeah. There's, when these things came out, and, somebody had asked me because, the George Floyd incident happened while I was in the role. And they said, what do you think about it? And I said, first and foremost, we need to remember somebody lost a life. What is it that we're doing as a group where we can be better to one another? Let's just
First,
stay right
first.
first, because that's what I can affect in my corner of the world. And, but knowing that we're kind of up against time, two good questions, because, and I think we need to do this again because I think there's so much more that we could get in.
Mhm.
So we don't discuss age, how old you are, how old I
Yeah.
am, but we can say you're over 21, footloose and fancy free. If you were to go back and tell and give advice of all, you've got so much of it. If you were to go back to your 21-year-old self, what would you be telling yourself to be a better leader,
Mm.
more impactful, faster, and making a difference on a broader scale? What things have you learned across your professional career that you wish you had gotten earlier?
Not everything I think I need to say. Learn that the hard way. You are to center what I know to be enough. There's always this, why can't I just be good and solid in what I know and contribute versus
Hmm.
this push of performance where it's like, you got to learn all these things, right? So I see HR professionals, like I went back to school last year at Cornell because I started to be concerned that I wasn't updated on all the nuances that had happened in the last couple of years around DEI. George, I was the oldest person in the class. And so I went there because I was like checking myself, like making sure that I had the expertise. I'm going to take 4 weeks on pronouns so I know what's going on. I'm going to take 6 weeks on whatever. I'm going to get another certification. And I think we have created a situation where people cannot be, I'm always about learning and growing, but why can't what I bring, my contributions in my bucket, be enough? I don't think
Hmm.
I think every HR person needs some grounding in DEI, but I don't think you have to be that has to be your total focus. I think it becomes really hard to push people in that space. So, when I think about my 20-year-old self and what I think about now is like, I'm good. I
Hmm.
am not going to be pushed to, even in this space, right? Like I've been asked to be on a bunch of panels about critical race theory. I did 2 of them and tapped out.
Yeah.
I'm like not coming into that space in that way and not going to be forced to think, somebody said in a panel, I don't understand how you could say that it's not just about race and you're a Black female. I said, because I'm a Black female, I'm saying it's not just about race. I don't, what are you talking about? There's more to it. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. Should we center race because it's the one people don't talk about? Sure. But is it only about race? You're not going to push me to say that because I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to say it. It's not my truth.
Well, I got to tell you, I would like to do this again because I have a lot more questions. But I don't only want to say thank you for coming on. You know, your advice, your insights, your experiences have made me a better human capital leader. And we didn't have that many interactions. But when I share with people, and I said at the beginning of this, as I get older, I'm like, my God, there's so much more. Now my dad looked far more wise. And being a parent and a grandfather, I'm like, there's so much I don't know. But I wanted to thank you personally for contributing to making me a better human capital leader, because now it wasn't that my horizons expanded. It's that I have perspectives that now really round out a lot of other common sense thoughts and you've created more of a sponge that, okay, now I got to get a little bit smarter, or now there's some things out there that I thought I knew that I didn't know, but now I've got the desire to explore. And I wanted to thank you for that. And for spending a little bit of time with me as well. You were just great.
I just got to say this. I appreciate that, but I want you to know that when I left that first interaction, I was excited about the iron sharpens iron opportunity.
Yeah.
So every time in your white male shell, white older guy shell that you sat in that space, the beautiful part about that, the synergy of that was your questions were insightful and spot on. You had a holistic approach to how are we measuring that and what are we measuring for? That was refreshing equally for me. And when I got in the car the first time, I thought, I wonder how this is going to play out, because one of the sharpest ones in the room is a white guy. And will they allow him or not to say it, right, as somebody that understood the culture of this organization? So likewise, George, I enjoyed and learned from you. We'll never know what's to come. Yep. Look forward to what that could be in the future at any time. And you call on me anytime. I absolutely have learned from you.
Oh, thank you so much. I love that you took the time. This has just been awesome. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will be in touch really, really soon.
Absolutely. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
And thank you for listening to the Talent War podcast, where we discuss all things talent, focusing on a talent mindset, the core belief that the only true competitive advantage you can hope to achieve and maintain is your talent. Join us for the next episode of the Talent War podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you heard, subscribe and please leave a review. Connect with me on Talent War Group's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram accounts, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. The Talent War podcast is brought to you by the Talent War Group, a management, consulting, and executive search firm. We work with you, bringing services like talent acquisition, leadership development, executive search, executive coaching, seminars, speaking engagements, all to create talent solutions for your most pressing business problems. To get started, visit us at www.talentwargroup.com.